Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today's a solo episode, and I have a topic I want to go over, and it's around training periodization. So I've talked a lot about nutrition periodization, and there will be a little bit of nutrition periodization in here because they, in my opinion, go hand in hand. But we're really going to focus on the training periodization side of things. Now, again, I'm always going to come at this from like a body comp, overall health perspective, but within talk about, I do think there is some wiggle room for, again, like athletics, how we can build that in, what this looks like. But again, I think that the main topic will be around body comp and overall health there, with kind of a subtopic around performance related endeavors, if you do have these, or like races or things that you do there with that. Because I'm always trying to intersect all those things, right? Body comp, performance, overall health. I think it's important to have all of those. And again, they all do go hand in hand to an extent. But before we dive into that, I'm looking to add clients currently. So currently accepting some applications for clients. Again, if you are someone who wants to improve body comp, overall health, performance, or again, maybe you've just been working super hard and you just feel like you're not changing your body as you would like, whether that's adding more muscle, losing some body fat. Again, it's just not happening, or again, there's just a lot of friction and you feel like you're having to work super hard to see any change, and you do want to make that process more efficient. Or maybe you just want to take things to the next level, right? Maybe you don't necessarily have anything that you're struggling with, but you do want to gain more knowledge and learn how to work with your body specifically. Then my coaching is for you. And if you're interested in that, you can reach out on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, or there's links in the show notes that you can set up a call or fill out an application, either one there, so we can discuss it in more detail. Again, always looking to add more motivated people to work with, right? Somebody that doesn't want to take things to the next level and is interested in data and learning about their body there. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. Like I said, what I want to talk about today is training periodization. And like I said, I've done a lot of talk around nutrition periodization. And like I said, we do need to touch on that because that is going to be important here in terms of, if we were to look at this, it's like, all right, what phase are we currently in? And that's going to dictate how we periodize it. So we will touch on that a little bit. But first, just real quick to go over periodization and training periodization. It's essentially just a way to have a game plan based on goals, but then also where you're currently at and where you want to go, right? One kind of block may lead to progressions for another block. Or again, periodization is just simply, hey, you do certain things at certain times of the year, and then you maybe slightly change it up versus feeling like you always need to do the same thing all the time, right? And when I talk nutrition periodization, it's the same thing. We're not always eating the same throughout the year. We're probably going to change that a little bit. There's some benefit to doing both. I did a podcast episode recently on why I do think we need to, while we can recomp and we don't necessarily need to be in these super aggressive bulking and cutting phases, we do need to still periodize our nutrition. And then even periodization can also be in nutrition periodization. Hey, during certain weeks, maybe you do some refeeds, right? Or we do calorie cycling. To me, that is a form of nutrition periodization. And so training is the same thing, right? You're manipulating different variables at different times of the year. And again, I like to, for what I do, like I said, bridging that gap between performance, body comp, and health is, I think we need to change our training throughout the year. So we're going to discuss what that looks like there. And so I think the first thing with training periodization is we do need to base it on what recovery and nutrition is like. If you have a busy period of time and recovery is going to be lower for whatever reason, you obviously have to adjust your training to match that. See too many people not focus on that and just try and push through. But we also need to base it on what does our nutrition look like. And so that's where, again, these distinct nutrition phases come into play, because what your nutrition looks like, how many calories you're bringing in, is going to impact your recovery and what you can do from a training perspective. And within this, I have these two distinct nutrition phases, and it's a building/fueling focus phase. And so that's essentially, hey, we're eating at least at maintenance, maybe a small surplus. Okay, so we're making sure we're well fueled. And then other times throughout the year, or again, maybe not necessarily throughout the year, maybe we're doing a energy deficit, and this would be a fat loss focus, right? And it's mostly, an energy deficit would mostly be from a fat loss focus side of things, right? Again, there could be some health reasons to get into a small deficit, right? Or again, just like I explained, I think there is a benefit to getting into a energy deficit every so often. So there could be some health aspects to it, maybe performance related, but essentially the goal is, in the energy deficit, we're going to be losing some body fat. And so that's ultimately what we're doing there. And that's going to lead to less energy coming in, which is going to lead to certain adaptations from your body's perspective, right? So those are going to be the two kind of branches that we're looking at here when we think about this. It's a building phase. It doesn't necessarily have to be this hard push. It's just, hey, we're fueling enough. Now, you could get nitty gritty and be like, hey, within that building, fueling focus phase, I'm going to make sure that I get in a surplus for a short period of time. You could do that, but you don't necessarily have to. The key thing being is, hey, we're not in an energy deficit. Now, somebody may ask, where does body recomp fall into this? And to me, if body recomp, there's kind of two separate ways to look at it. It's over time, you're changing your body composition, less fat, more muscle. So obviously within that, you're doing these different sort of phases, but between building, energy deficit. But then there's this sort of simultaneous recomp that most people are after, right? That simultaneous muscle gain and fat loss. And what did I just say? We can break this down to two distinct phases: energy deficit, maintenance slash feeling enough. And so obviously the deficit would fall, or the recomp with the simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain would fall within that energy deficit there. All right, so we have those two distinct phases there that we need to differentiate before we move forward, right? Because again, that is going to impact what we do from a training perspective. And so just to sum this up, training should match the nutrition phase you're in. It should match your recovery capacity, which falls into I think it's probably those two things, your life stress. And then we do need to, also consider performance related goals. Does somebody have some sort of performance related goal that they need to be ready for, whether that's a race, or maybe you're just a rec sports, or maybe you're an athlete, right? Like you need to manage your training around that nutrition periodization phase that you're in based on what your performance goals are, right? Because again, we don't want to, if you have a very performance oriented goal that doesn't require weight cutting, you probably want to head into that well-fueled, but you don't want to be in an energy deficit with that, okay? So how we're going to take this, we're going to start with, okay, what are the things that we can do in a building phase? And then what can we do in a fat loss phase? Because we're going to have a lot more wiggle room in terms of what we can do in a building phase versus a fat loss phase. And so we're going to start with the building phase. So again, remember, in the building phase, we're going to be at maintenance calories or higher, depending on what your overall goals are and what we need to do. Now, your caloric intake could change based on how much training you're doing, et cetera, right? So it's not like it's a set number where maintenance is X amount of calories, and then if you go over that, it's a surplus. It could be, hey, you're starting to move more, you're training a lot more, so now your maintenance needs are a bit higher, but you're not necessarily in a surplus. Or it could be, hey, we want to have some time where we do gain a little bit of body fat, and you need to be in a surplus. And so it just depends on what your overall goals are in general. So in a building phase, this is training. This is the time to push, right? This is the time to ramp up your training, ramp up your volume, really push performance. However, it still does need to be in line with your recovery. We can't just ramp up training volume at all costs. We have to make sure we can recover from it. And it needs to obviously match your current life situation. That's why I like this phase, because we can match it with it, where it's like, hey, even though maybe you can't necessarily have a hard push towards building a lot of muscle, or you don't think it's a hard push phase, it's like you still need to match that with what you can do in that phase, right? For example, take somebody who maybe, I'm just going to use myself. Okay, we're going to have a kid soon. I'm never going to be like, oh, I'm just maintaining, I'm not trying to do anything. It's like, hey, I'm going to try and set myself up to still build some muscle where I can, making sure I'm well fueled. And maybe I'm focusing on other things besides just building muscle, but I'm still going to set myself up to do that as much as possible. I'm never just going to be like, oh, I just want to maintain. But again, what we do is going to match the current life situation and obviously our expectations, but we're still going to try to get as much out of that as possible there. So obviously the more stuff you have going on, the less likely it is that you can have this quote unquote hard push, but we still need to think that we still want to be in that mindset of, hey, I'm still moving forward here. Even if it's so small muscle growth, it's non-detectable. It's like you're still building some muscle, right? And again, it does need to be in line with recovery still. So this is the time to push it. But again, we still want to push. And again, we still want to push. We still can ramp up our training volume, but we don't have this endless supply of recovery capacity. We still need to manage that and make sure that's in check there. But again, I just see this kind of commonly flipped around, right? Where it's, building phase is a phase where you're outside of fat loss. Like, oh, this is time to just chill and not really focus on training, do whatever, maybe train way less. And again, there could be a time and place for that, right? I'm not saying you need to be like that forever, but then people turn it on in fat loss phase. Oh, now's the time to go. And you're probably missing out on really changing your body. Again, you don't necessarily, like I was just saying there, you don't have to be training 18 days a week to make progress. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's just, hey, we need this to fit where you're currently at. But this is the time that we do want to try really push training, at least at some point in time there. And obviously for some people, they just get, I guess, super busy, or a lot of life situations come up, and maybe it is a lot harder to progress during this time. But I think at some point in time, if you want to change your physique and build a solid body composition, really push performance and improve that, like, you do need to have that dedicated time to that. But like I said, maybe certain life situations or certain cycles of life call for less or more or whatever. Now, the cool thing with this is obviously if you build muscle during one of these pushes, it's like it doesn't necessarily just go away, right? Once you build it, it is easier to maintain, but that building part does likely require some period of time where you can dedicate some time to it. Now, again, doesn't mean all or nothing with it, if that makes sense there. So remember, in a building, like, this would also be the phase where, again, if you have any sort of performance related goals, like you want to improve your VO2 max, you want to finally be able to run a race in a certain amount of time. Yes, you obviously need to make sure your body weight does have a impact on that, but we need that fuel to recover and to push. We don't want to be in a deficit, right? So again, if you're looking at those types of goals, if you do like a DECA because I have a client who does DECAs, or you do high rocks, right? You don't want to, maybe you need to drop some weight and improve your body composition, but you don't want to do those events around times when you're in a energy deficit, right? So again, if we're getting ready for those, yes, you may, if you're overweight and you lose some weight, like you'll likely see your improvements, your performance improve because again, you're lowering body weight. It's that muscle to strength ratio, muscle to, again, your performance ratio is just going to be a lot better. And so for that, for you, that could be helpful, but you still wouldn't want to necessarily have a large deficit going into that, right? So again, we're going to plan those things around phases where we're feeling enough. And remember, it doesn't have to be a surplus. It can be maintenance calories as well too. But what we're going to take this from is a building phase for somebody that wants to improve body composition. Maybe they just want to feel more like an athlete. They want to improve their overall health. They just want to feel good. That's what we're going to take this because there's so many different ways that we could go with it. But that's obviously the lens that we're going to take this through here. So to me, there's three different ways that we can go about this, right? Obviously, in a building phase, we want to make sure that we lift some weights because we know muscle's important, strength's important. And then we probably want to do some form of cardiovascular training. Now, obviously, things will span differently. There's, again, many different ways that we can take this. And so I like to think of this in terms of there's three different ways that we can go about this. And I'll talk about who these phases would be good for. I'm going to also talk about how this can look in a year and everything like that. I'll probably finish up with that after I go through the fat loss in the building. So remember, we're currently talking about within a building phase here. And so again, there's three distinct things that we can do. I'm just going to start with lifting focus, right? So this is where most people that are doing body comp, they want to build some muscle like during this phase, we're going to have a lifting focus, okay? And so what does that mean? You're probably lifting 3 to 6 days a week in this block of training, right? A block of training can be anywhere from 2 weeks up to 24 weeks, right? And so just think of this as, hey, this training block is, hey, we're focused on adding muscle. That's what I'm going to take this as, because there are different ways that within lifting we can periodize things, which I'll go over. Generally speaking, though, when it comes to muscle growth, you don't need to have things structured in a certain way where it's like, hey, you need to work on strength and do this, and then you can build into that. With hypertrophy, muscle growth, it really comes down to providing that tension and doing that over time, okay? So that becomes the most important thing. That's what we need to do in this lifting focus phase. You're looking at 3 to 6 days of lifting per week during this time, okay? Most clients I'm going to have are going to fall around that 4 on average, right? Maybe it's 1 day less, maybe it's a little bit more. Can you do 2 here? Yes, but at that point, that would apply that you can't do a lot of training right now, and that's fine. We could still make that work, but ideally in a lifting focus kind of block of training, we're doing 3 to 6 days of lifting, right? I want to hit each muscle group 2 times a week, probably hitting at least 6 to 8 to 10 sets per muscle group per week, maybe even more depending on what we can recover from and what we need, right? So we're doing 3 to 6 days of lifting, and then we're probably doing 1 to 3 days of cardio sessions during this, okay? What counts as cardio? To me, it's anything that's probably going to get that heart rate above 120-ish, 130-ish, okay? We could count steps, but to me, steps are separate, and so we would still do steps here. And then, so like I said, 1 to 3 days of cardio. We're probably going to get 1 day of an interval session in there, probably a medium intensity cardio. If you go up to 3, that next one could be a zone 2, but probably on average, it would be 1 to 2 days of cardio here with this. I think once you get to 3, it can get a little bit hard to fit it in this situation. And then so from a nutrition standpoint, obviously here in this, we need to be eating at least at maintenance calories, maybe even slightly higher depending on where you're at. Obviously, we want to make sure we're getting in enough protein. We don't want to jack up carbs or essentially wouldn't want to jack up carbohydrates to where then protein is low. We need carbs. They are important, but if lifting is our main focus, you just need enough. You don't necessarily need to go crazy with the carbohydrates, right? But it all depends on your recovery and everything, and overall movement, how many steps you're getting, et cetera. But we do want to make sure we get enough protein. And then obviously lifting is, like I said, those are the things that we can do in the lifting. Yeah, we'll do those up to 6 days, potentially, depending on what you want to do. And so who would this phase be better for? And this is going to be someone who really does want to build max muscle, right? So it's like, hey, I really want to maximize muscle growth. So again, if you're a bodybuilder, you probably need to be in this phase more often than not in your block, within a building phase, right? This probably needs to be where you're at the majority of the time. Maybe you have a previous high endurance background. If you're at risk of, say, low energy availability, and what I mean by that is you're someone who is a higher risk of not eating enough, this is probably going to be better for you in your building phase there. And then if you have a good cardio base already, so again, if you have that high endurance background, you have that good cardio base, this would definitely, and you really want to maximize muscle growth, whether that's just a personal goal that you have, or again, you're say you're a bodybuilder, then obviously you would be spending most of your time here, and this would probably be the phase that you're going to be in most of the time. And so this leads me to, this is probably more so where I would put a lot of women, not everyone, right? Because some people, and the reason I say that is because usually, and remember, I'm speaking generally here, women tend to have a higher endurance background and already have a solid cardio base and likely need less cardio compared to men. And so that's why I'm leaning to like in a building phase, I'm probably going to push more women to this because women are also, again, generally speaking, because I've definitely seen this with men too, but they're just at a higher risk of lower energy availability during phases where you do a little bit more training volume, right? So because of that, we do want to be careful with doing like a ton of training volume if that's the case, because then what happens is if we do a bunch of training volume and now you have a maybe background of nutrition where you're scared to eat a lot of food or you're scared to eat carbohydrates, it's like now you're going to run into issues there. And it's like now we're going to defeat the purpose of this phase and you could get yourself stuck long term, right? So that's why I think this is best for. So again, this is great for both men and women. For me, like there's definitely times in a building phase where this is what I want to do. I really want to push muscle growth, really ramp up the volume of my training in this during this time within reason, right? You don't just want to randomly do it. And I've definitely was here most of my life, and I probably was at 0 days of cardio. I've learned that, hey, you still want to do some cardio. So again, we're still going to do some cardio, but lifting really is our thing that we're trying to prioritize here, right? That's going to be the thing where you need to make sure you get that in each week. We want to be fresh for our lifting, all those things. Like that's your baby during this time, and that's what you really want to focus on during this block, okay? So that's lifting. And then we have what I would call a cardio-focused block. And again, we'll talk about weeks here, but again, this is where we're probably going to drop down lifting, right? So instead of doing upwards of 4, 5, 6 days of lifting, we're probably going to do about 2 to 3 days in most situations. Because you squeeze in 4 maybe, but then that would maybe go into my third category here. But you're probably going to do 2 to 3 days of lifting. You're probably going to do upwards of 3 to 6 days of cardio. I could even say 7 days. Now, this is just days, right? This isn't necessarily sessions. So just keep that in mind. And so really the goal here is, hey, you're going to prioritize cardio where possible. You may, if you have to go back to back, you may do cardio first versus doing lifting, right? If you have a week where you can only train a certain amount of times, you may prioritize cardio. Now, again, this depends. If you're doing 3 days, I think it's okay if you did 2 days of lifting versus if you're just doing 2 days. I really wouldn't want somebody going lower than that here. Now, the only example of this would be, hey, if you are like you run races, have an endurance background, you need to do this, then okay, maybe we do drop it down to 1 time a week every once in a while. But again, we need to watch recovery, right? Because with cardio, to get the best adaptations, like the more you can do, the better it's going to be. Now, again, it has to be within reason. Can you do it? Are you recovering? And so you have to watch recovery. But yeah, like because you're doing such high volume, like you do need to watch that. You can't always just go balls to the wall in your cardio sessions, right? Yeah, you can't do every session as an interval session, right? I think the more days of cardio you do, more of them end up needing to be like quote unquote zone 2. So let's say you got crazy and you wanted to do 6 days a week. Now, who would be doing 6 days a week? This would probably be people that are, again, trying to train for a marathon. Again, just training for these long races, and you enjoy doing this as well too, right? And you can recover from it and you have the time because all those things are super important. Again, if you're doing those, at least 2 to 3 of those are likely going to be more like kind of zone 2, right? Calories may be a bit higher than they would be in your lifting focus. I can't say that for sure, but because you're just doing more volume of movement overall, your calories may be a bit higher. And I do think carbs become even more important here, where timing's likely a bit more important. Like you need to make sure you're getting more around your workouts. If you're doing, say, a weight training and a cardio session in the same day, like your timing around those becomes more important. You need to make sure you fuel up in between them. And so, like I said, this is especially important if you're doing 2 a days, but maybe you have a cardio session late one day. It's like, hey, you need to fuel up before you go and do your weight training the next morning, right? And like I said, recovery is important. So sleep, managing that, looking at things like your resting heart rate, your HRV to make sure those aren't going in the wrong direction for too long is super important. How do you feel from a biofeedback standpoint, right? So this is cardio focus. So again, like who would be who would do this? Well, one, again, if you are like more of endurance sports type person, maybe you're an athlete in the off season, like this would probably be you for some of it, or you'd be here maybe a little bit more. It just depends, right? It depends on the person on what exactly you're doing. But again, if you have some sport, or again, you really want to improve your conditioning, your cardiovascular fitness, and you're like, I want to go all in on this. This would be for you, right? I think this is also great if you need to focus on improving cardio, right? So if you are someone that maybe we looked at, hey, you do need to, you already have a good amount of muscle on you or a decent amount, it's like, hey, we may need to switch you to this. Again, we could use this later in a build phase, which I'll talk about in a little bit here, where maybe you gained a few pounds in your build or you just added muscle, right? That muscle is going to require you to you need to build your cardiovascular fitness around that new muscle, right? You need to make sure that muscle you can build that too, which a lot of people don't, right? And it's hard to keep up with it. And so this is a way to potentially do that. But again, maybe, like I said, you have been in a surplus for a little while or maintenance, and you've kind of seen your weight trend up. And again, you now want to build that cardiovascular fitness at that new weight. Like this, you could throw it in the middle of 2 separate lifting focus phases. So again, you don't necessarily have to be an endurance runner. Now, again, endurance runners and athletes and stuff would probably spend more time here compared to someone who's like, hey, I want to build a lot of muscle, etc. Or again, maybe as you're been deeper into your building phase, your resting heart rate has started to creep up, right? Like that's a sign that, hey, you probably need potentially, or your HRV is lowered. That's probably a sign we need to focus a little bit more on building some cardiovascular fitness. Now, it could also mean that you're under recovered, and just throwing on a bunch of training isn't helpful either. So it does depend here. And then I think the other benefit of this is if you've always been someone who's trained 4, 5, 6 days a week weightlifting, this would be a great way to give your body a little bit of a break for a little bit, right? Because I think with this phase, again, depending on what it is, we could do this for anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be this like, oh, it has to be 12, 24 weeks, or it has to be your whole building phase, right? Like you have the ability to be able to change this around there. So again, it could be a great way to kind of do a mini deload from your resistance training in a phase, right? So not only could it help you potentially recover, now you do this phase and now you built your cardiovascular fitness because you can see pretty good results in say 2 to 6 weeks or slightly longer, especially if you've never spent time doing this, right? You've always maybe focused on weight training. Like you can see some pretty good progress here if you make this kind of your sole purpose and we just kind of focus a little bit more on maintaining our muscle here, right? And that in turn, what's that going to do? Then you go back to your phase. Now you got better cardiovascular fitness for your current body weight and your current amount of muscle. And that's going to allow you to push deeper, recover better, and potentially do more in your lifting focus training later on, right? So that's who would use this, right? Again, people that would, so again, like women would still use this, but for me, the use for it would be, hey, we know you can definitely feel enough. Hey, you've gained a little bit of weight. Your resting heart rate's starting to trend up. And we just need to take a little bit of a break from resistance training for a little bit. Or you're from a female perspective, like you really need to build your cardiovascular fitness for like a sport or something like that. And then men, I think, but again, the key always comes back to, hey, making sure we resistance train and understand that, hey, this isn't a time that we're really going to be pushing muscle growth during this time. You may find that an endurance runner is going to spend most of their year here in this phase, right? But I think even for endurance type athlete, they probably need to do depending on where they're at, they probably need to do a lifting focus phase, maybe every once in a while. Again, depending on where they're at. Maybe their lifting focus is more strength, because that's one thing I haven't gone over yet is, hey, what are the different sort of periodization we can do within lifting, right? It doesn't always have to be hypertrophy there, which I'm going to go over here in a little bit. So that's who would use the cardio focus phase, right? So I did one of these inside my building phase probably a couple months ago. I was doing 4 days of lifting, 2 days of cardio, and I switched to 3 and 3, right? Is that a huge difference? Probably not. It wasn't a huge change, but hey, I did drop lifting down to go even further. I could have done 2 lifting and 4 cardio, but I just didn't. I personally didn't want to do that, but definitely something in the future that I could do there. And I just felt like I didn't need to per se, right? It's not like my resting heart rate was super high there. But for some people, they've never done any sort of cardio. Again, you don't necessarily have to do a lot if you've never done it. But again, that could be something that you could throw in there. Because again, I gave you the range of 3 to 6 days. It doesn't necessarily have to be 6 days all the time. Okay, so we have lifting and we have cardio focus. That's where we are just really prioritizing one or the other. Then we have what I would call a combo focus, okay? So this is where, hey, we still want to build some muscle. I also want to see how hard I can push my conditioning as well too. And so this is where you're going to look at, hey, maybe you're doing 3 to 5 days of lifting and upwards of 2 to 5 days of cardio, right? And I'll talk about how we can potentially up that cardio dose without adding a ton of fatigue to the situation. So you're doing a combination focus. I find that I probably have, like I said, I think most of my clients are going to fall in that lifting, but it's going to be closer to this lifting/combo focus that we're going to be at here. And again, I'll talk about the pros and cons of both. Again, same thing. We're still trying to hit each muscle group 2 times a week during this. All the same things apply. Maybe you're not necessarily going to push volume of muscle growth like volume of sets super high. Like you would save that more for the lifting focus, right? Where you have that recovery capacity. But maybe you're doing closer to moderate/slightly higher volumes. And again, maybe we add in some body part specialization, which I'll talk about here in a little bit in terms of the different periodization that we can do inside lifting there. And then 2 to 5 days of cardio, right? Now, you can build up both. That's obviously the pro of this. Because recovery capacity is limited, you're probably not necessarily maximizing either. So again, if you want to see the quickest return on investment, you probably want to pick one or the other, right? In terms of really ramping one up, dialing one back a little bit. If you can definitely do both and try and get both at the same time. Again, to me, it's a lot like body recomp where you can do both at the same time, but it's likely somewhat constrained in terms of what you can do. Now, this is dependent on the person, where they're coming from, their background, right? If someone doesn't have good cardiovascular fitness and they don't have a lot of muscle, you're obviously going to see quicker return on investment by doing this. But obviously, the better cardio shape you get in, the more muscle you build, it's going to be really hard to continue to grow and do both at the same time because, again, the amount required for it's just going to be tough to recover from, right? And so there are, to me, bigger recovery costs here when we're trying to push both at the same time. And so you really need to make sure that's in check, right? So we'll talk about what that is, but sleep, fueling enough, et cetera, like those are going to be super important things that we need to focus on during this time. And again, I'll talk about a little bit nutrition that I think could help you here with this. Who is this better for? Again, it's somebody that one enjoys doing both because I think that's important. Like for me, this is where I put myself at right now is this combo focus because I enjoy doing both. I'd like to have a little bit of a higher output in terms of like training. When I say that, I just like to be training regularly, but like so I want to see both. So I'm just trying to dip into both, understanding that, hey, it's probably impacting both at the same time in some form or fashion. So, that's who I think it would be good for. I think it's also better for someone who fueling isn't a problem. You're going to be able to eat enough because that is going to be super important during this, right? If you want to try and see good change within both in a decent amount of time, you're going to have to make sure you're recovering. Again, you can't just overeat because that's not going to be good, but you do need to make sure you're fueling enough, right? And that may require you to increase your maintenance calories may come up a little bit. I think this is fine if we talked about potentially low muscle mass as being somebody who this was for, but just because from the fact and low cardio fitness, because it really just doesn't require much to progress, but eventually you may be better off this in a while. I think if you already have a decent amount of muscle already and you're not trying to grow a ton in a short amount of time, that I think this is good for you. And then again, like I said, if you have that kind of moderate to low cardio fitness, like you're not like you probably could get away with doing this because the amount isn't a ton. But again, you're not going to see the quickest return on investment from a cardiovascular fitness standpoint there, right? But again, you also need good sleep habits. You need to manage your stress load and it needs to be fairly low, right? And then obviously you need to look at blood work, make sure you're recovering during this. And one way that we can ramp up the frequency of cardio is maybe you do 2 to 3 days, their own dedicated days. Now, again, you're either going to have to do more 2 days, which is going to require the proper fueling, or you're going to have to basically ensure that you can train 7 days a week. You may have to push out your week. Like it may not be a perfect 7-day week, if that makes sense. You may have to push it out to 8, 9, 10 days potentially. And that's kind of your cycle there, right? It's 10 days versus 7 days. Again, so long as we're hitting we're getting enough cardio and we're getting enough weight training in during that time. So there's less flexibility here, but some ways that we can get a little bit more cardio in if we want to kind of cram it in a smaller amount of time is I like to use like a 6 or 7 minute kind of row to start. Progressive 6 is what Dr. Mike T. Nelson calls it. I've done it 6, 7 minutes. And essentially you're just kind of the last 2 minutes or so, you're kind of getting into that kind of max kind of range. And it can be a way to get a little bit more frequency in without a huge recovery cost and not a huge time commitment, right? Now, you still would want to do some sessions where you do a little bit. And again, I think the other big thing here is going to be you're going to have to manage your intensity inside your cardio and probably even weight training, right? You're going to have to really watch that and do that relative to whatever your recovery is around that time. From a nutrition perspective, some things that we'd want to look for here in this kind of phase is, again, carb timing is going to be important, especially if you're doing 2 a days, like making sure you're fuel for that. Recovery is going to be super important. You can't just go balls to the wall. You have to kind of manage your training load. You're probably going to have to auto-regulate your training in terms of how hard you push there. And then again, you're going to need to make sure you're eating enough calories there, right? So those are the 3 different phases. Now, what I wanted to go over are going to be within lifting. How can we potentially periodize that and what does that look like? To me, we kind of have, all right, the first kind of question is, do we want to be a little bit more hypertrophy focused or do we want to be a little bit more strength focused? That's one way that you can kind of go with things there. Maybe if somebody doesn't want to necessarily add a lot of muscle, maybe they are a little bit more strength focused, right? And again, that to me would be something that would potentially be looked at in terms of the cardio focus, right? Again, you could do a strength kind of focus within the lifting in terms of 3 to 6 days. And that's where you're really trying to just build up strength. Maybe you have a powerlifting competition or something like that, right? Like that could be the case with that. So we have those 2 things. Again, like I said, within strength, like I usually don't program just strength for people. I'm not a powerlifting coach. So there's probably some branches of periodization within that you could do, but I'm not going to go into that. And then obviously the other branch of the lifting is the hypertrophy side of things. And like I was saying, you don't necessarily need to have this like perfect periodization for hypertrophy, right? It's just you need the stimulus and you need to do that over time. Now within that, we could change some programming variables within training blocks, right? Of maybe you were going to work in a slightly higher rep range here and there for certain things. Maybe we're going to add in a little bit more drop sets here and there. Maybe we're going to go with a slightly higher volume for a short amount of time. You could do that from a heavy perspective. But another thing that you could do within hypertrophy is body part specialization. I wouldn't do body part specialization in a cardio focused phase. It would have to be a lifting phase and maybe a combo focused phase, depending on, again, can you recover? What muscle groups are we using? And how does that impact everything that you're doing overall there, right? But body part specialization is essentially we're picking maybe 1 to 2 muscle groups that we either want to grow or maybe requires a little bit more volume, and we're hammering those and maybe some other stuff's closer to maintenance during that time, right? So that's essentially what body part specialization is. That's how you could fit that in within that. So those are different like sort of lifting periodization things that we can do within the lifting side of things. So that's building, right? And again, all these things are going to be dependent on the person, where they're at. I went over some things where I felt like certain ones were better for others who fit the combo focus, et cetera, right? I think with the combo focus, again, I think women can totally do that. I just think that it's probably, again, for most women that I work with, it's going to be more of the lifting focus, and their dose of cardio can just be a lot less overall, right? So that's where that will be. And then again, but again, if you want to be more of a, you could call it a hybrid athlete, right? Because like for me, the combo too is I play hockey once a week. So like you could replace one of those cardio sessions with like a sport that you play, right? And so that could be hybrid. I guess it could be hybrid, right? That's essentially what it is, kind of hybrid there. And so again, I think just with hybrid, you just need to make sure you're recovering. And again, I think programming also becomes like super important too, right? It's not just, hey, go balls to the wall and push it all the time. Like you need to manage that as well. And like I said, you just need to make sure you're feeling enough there. And that's the biggest thing. All right. So that's it within a building phase. Then we have a fat loss phase, right? So what are we trying to do here in a fat loss phase? Remember, in a fat loss phase, the main goal is the energy deficit, right? Maybe there is a health, like really the only thing I could think of is health. Hey, you just need to, maybe you aren't necessarily super overweight, but hey, you haven't been in a deficit for a while. But again, that wouldn't require you to be in a fat loss phase for too long. And you probably could experience a lot of the benefits of what I would say more AMPK activation through exercise. So I don't think you necessarily, I think the more exercise, you don't necessarily always need to do a fat loss phase. I've made the case, hey, you should do a fat loss phase every so often. And I do still agree with that. But I think the more you train, the more output you have. You probably don't need to do that as often for those people. But again, remember, in a fat loss phase, our goal is to lose body fat. And so that really needs to be the thing that we're doing, and the goal is to preserve performance and muscle during fat loss, because we don't want to lose muscle. And so this isn't to say we can't make progress in a fat loss phase. That's definitely not what I'm saying here. I definitely think it can happen. It's just that's not the main goal. It's think of that sort of as like the bonus, right? The main goal is, hey, let's get you to drop body fat and then let's get the hell out of here. That's essentially what we need to do with a fat loss phase. And again, this could be if you're somebody who you play, again, I'm going to take this from a body comp perspective. I'm going to go over how body comp can impact some of this a little bit. But sorry, I lost where I was going with that. But so body comp will impact that. And again, this also is dependent on if you're like an athlete and you're doing something like, remember, you don't want to have this phase leading up to whatever performance you're having. Again, unless it's like, obviously from a bodybuilding competition standpoint, you obviously have to, for that sport, you have to be in a deficit leading up to your competition. But if it's anything else, like you really don't want to be. The only other thing I can think of was like for a fighter, you're probably, depending on where you're at to make weight, you might have to. But again, I think that should still, like you still want to be careful with that. And some of these things that I'm talking about are going to be important, right? I'm going to talk about, hey, if you do want to do a lot of training, maybe see some performance increases during this time. Here's some things that we can do to help do that. But all right. And so again, to lose body fat, we're going to be eating less calories. Okay. So because of that, our recovery is going to be lower. So what this means is we need to do less training and we need to do what we can with performance. We want to preserve it, but our main goal isn't to increase performance during this time. And so again, this is an ideal time for pushing. This is where, again, a lot of people will start to throw in a bunch of training, right? Oh, I'm going to do all these fat loss workouts. I'm going to push training now. I'm in a fat loss. No, unfortunately, that's not the time to do this. Again, we're just trying to preserve things and trying to get out of that energy deficit as soon as we can and not really be in it any longer than we need to be there. Again, there's certain things we can do to manipulate that. I guess real quick too, to go back to the building, what else would fall in the combo focus? 2 to 5 days of cardio, but again, you could say sport specific work or sports, right? So again, I think CrossFit, like again, with that, like that would be the time to build your fitness in CrossFit is when you're feeling enough, not in a fat loss phase. But most people will do the opposite and be like, oh, I'm going to use CrossFit to get in shape. It's like, no, we're not. Again, we're just kind of missing the forest through the tree, or we're just missing the big picture with what we're trying to do in a deficit. And so what should training look like? So we know that, hey, this is not ideal for pushing during this time. So I think lifting should be I think you could get away with 2 days. It depends on what you're doing. Now, again, for most of my body comp clients, like they're not competing in anything. They're not athletes. I think 3 days, I would want to keep somebody at least at 3 days. I think 3 to 4 days is totally fine. We're not doing super high training volumes. Like we don't necessarily have to do less training volume, but we're definitely not doing more than what we did in our building phase during this, right? 1 to 2 RIR, hitting each muscle group twice a week. And like I said, that can be accomplished in as little as 2. It depends again on your sport, or what you're doing. But ideally we're keeping in 3 to 4. And like I said, for my body comp clients, which are 99% of them, we're keeping in 3 to 4 days of lifting here. Obviously, cardio is going to be based on recovery and how much time we can dedicate. I think we should do 1 to 3 days based on recovery and but the big thing here is we could potentially, I'm still concerned about volume to an extent, but I'm less concerned about, you could do a decent amount of volume, but it just has to be closer to that, like zone 2. If you start to accumulate a lot, I'm less likely to have somebody do like really high end cardio training in a deficit. Now, again, they could, but it would definitely be managed probably just 1 day a week. We really want to watch intensity in our cardio sessions, right? We want to keep volume the same or fairly low in lifting, keep intensity high, 1 to 2 RIR cardio. We can keep volume closer to moderate to slightly higher, but we really need to watch intensity when we do it and obviously look at recovery there. And you would need to make sure you're fueling for that essentially. And then you could do some steps on top of it, right? Maybe that's an easy way to accumulate more volume with a low fatigue cost with it, right? And again, typically looking at 8 to 10K steps per day. And so I very rarely would have somebody go over 4 days of lifting in a fat loss phase. I just don't think that would be necessarily the greatest. Now, again, it depends on many things. If somebody is recomping or coming back from training, potentially, but I still would probably lean towards closer to 4 for most people. Now, I'm saying that you may find some bodybuilders that may go a bit higher, but I just don't think that you necessarily need to do that here. I think you're better off 3 to 4 days of lifting, preserving your muscle. And again, certain people definitely with 4 days of lifting, 1 to 2 RIR, and again, we're also being careful with super high rep training all the time. I don't think you don't necessarily have to shy away from it at all, but you definitely don't want to do it all the time. But the thing is, for a lot of people, you work on this quality, maybe they're slightly higher body fats, they're still going to build some muscle in this, right? That's not that we're not trying to necessarily, that's not the main thing that we're doing, but you have to think that more stored energy on your body is energy. And so that does give us a little bit more wiggle room here in terms of what we can do, right? And that's, again, kind of your prototypical best person to recomp, but we know it can still happen to other people as well too. Now, let's say, what if you want, or you need to do a lot of training / movement for whatever reason, right? Maybe you just enjoy it. You want to do a little bit more. Okay, that's fine. We can do it, but we have to adjust our caloric intake. We can't be in a super large deficit, super low calories and trying to do a bunch of training. You have to bring your calories up. Now, you still want to get that deficit, but you are going to have to bring your calories up a little bit around that. There was a carbohydrate availability paper recently that showed carbs around training or 4 days of higher carb intake relative to low carb intake can offset some of the negative adaptations of low energy availability from fat loss. And so carbs can help preserve that a little bit, and it can help keep your high end output up. And so to me, that's something that you could do. Hey, more carbs around your training can help you train a little bit harder, get some better adaptations, and really push that. Now, in saying that, you're still in a deficit, so it's not going to magically erase all that, but it can help. You need to watch the overall deficit. The larger the deficit is, the less training you're going to be able to do, et cetera, right? So that is going to be important. Like I said, meal timing, I think, around your training to me is super important during this time. And we can use refeed days. So essentially having days where if you have high output days or you have harder training days or you're slightly under recovered, you could throw in some refeed days at maintenance and increasing your carbohydrates, right? So now you're getting enough carbs, but you're also losing out on you're not getting the downsides of the low energy availability. Those just aren't fat loss days though, right? You're not going to drop body fat at maintenance calories on there. So that's kind of what we look at from a fat loss phase. It really becomes okay, what's our goal of this fat loss phase? It's not to just improve performance. Now, saying this, what you will see happen, and this is why I also think you don't necessarily have to, cardio almost becomes more about, again, maintaining what you have. So you still want to get that stimulus, but doing some lower intensity cardio can, again, be a lower fatigue thing, but it can also increase your energy expenditure. Now, again, same thing applies, the larger the deficit is, et cetera, will still happen. So that's where I think the role of cardio slightly changed, because when we're in a fat loss phase and we drop some weight, whether it's your VO2 max or your cardiovascular fitness will likely improve just as a byproduct of dropping some weight and losing some body fat. And we're kind of getting the benefit of that. And so we don't necessarily need to push cardio any harder because you're already getting the benefit of that, right? Really where you want to push your performance, like I said, in your cardiovascular fitness is in a building phase there. Because again, you'll see your resting heart rate come down when you're in a deficit, right? Again, that's the sign that your get fitness is improving. Just obviously, if you ever ran or done cardio 5 to 10 pounds every year, it's just a little bit harder on the body. And you kind of get those easy gains from that in this phase there. So that's kind of what training would look like during a fat loss. And again, ideally, we're not doing this around any sort of things that we need to perform with. Yep. That is the fat loss phase. All right, so let's talk about how this would look throughout the year. And let's say you're going to do a building phase for 36 weeks. You're coming off fat loss. Maybe that first phase, we're doing more lifting focus, right? It's hey, you're at a little bit lower body weight, you're leaner. Ideally, we didn't lose any muscle, but let's milk out getting back into a little bit higher, more calories. Maybe we'll see some muscle growth just by doing that when you can put more into your training, right? So again, the lifting's going to be balanced. Maybe you're doing 4 lifting sessions and 2 cardio sessions, right? You do that 12-week block there. And then the next block, you kind of have the option, hey, where's this person at? What do they want to work on? So it's either going to be a combo or lifting focus, right? And again, this will be another 12-week block. Maybe you figured out, hey, I want to do some body part specialization. Now, this would be the time to do that. Maybe you're going to do 4 to 5 lifting sessions, depending on if you're doing more combo or lifting focus. And then maybe you're bumping cardio up to 3 to 4 sessions, right? Or if you're staying lifting focused, it maybe is 2. And again, maybe for one of those 4 sessions, we're using the kind of frequency there of a lower, a 7-minute cardio session or something like that, right? And then maybe, you know what? Hey, I've gained a little bit of body weight, muscles up. Maybe now it's time for a cardio focus for 4 weeks, right? I'm going to drop down to 2 lifting sessions, get that benefit there of less wear and tear on the body, give my joints a break. And then I'm going to bump up to 4 to 5 cardio sessions during that time, right? And then you do that, now you feel better, and then maybe you go back to combo or lifting for 8 to 12 weeks, and then you go into fat loss where now we're just trying to focus on fat loss and maintaining it for say 8 to 12 weeks or so there. So that's kind of what an entire year or a little under a year would look like. I guess if you add in the next 16 weeks, it's typical what a fat loss phase could be there. So that's kind of how I would program things out and what that would look like throughout the year there. So I hope this episode was helpful and gave you some insight into how you can periodize your training and what that looks like and how you can focus on different fitness characteristics throughout the year and how the periodization of nutrition will impact that. So hope this episode was helpful. If you guys have any questions on it, you can just reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active. And make sure you give me a follow on there as well too. And if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find it. So with that out of the way, or sorry, going back to the beginning, I will talk to you guys next time.